evening, everyone, and welcome to the June meeting of the League of Women Voters. Lost a month here. We are glad you are with us this evening. I've got a few things that I need to remind you about, and that is, if you haven't yet paid your dues for this year, please see that you get them in to Jane. And I don't know how many of you may have listened to the redistricting forums. There was one going on right now, I think, at the state capitol. But our district will be represented primarily at the meeting in Columbus on July the 28th. And I would like to know, you can let me know at another time, but how many of you would like to go down and represent our group at the Columbus meeting. Other than that, we'll move from redistricting to campaign finance, and it's all kind of tied together one way or another. We are delighted to have Jen McNeely with us this evening, who has had a lot of experience in the field, and we'll just turn it over to Jen right now.
Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. I actually used to live in Douglas County, so I wasn't too far from the Carroll County community, and I used to go there quite a bit. So I appreciate y'all having me tonight to talk about a subject that I'm really interested in. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see it and follow along as I talk. Let's do that real quick. Okay, are you able to see my screen? Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So some takeaways that I want you all to have today, and you can stop me if you've got a question. But the three takeaways I want you to have as I go through this presentation is that political fundraising is a highly regulated industry. Understanding campaign finance laws and regulations and all of the things that govern the body politic is so important, but one of the key issues when it comes to campaign finance rules is that when people don't know the rules, they can fall into issues when it comes to civil and criminal penalties. And because the rules can be quite confusing, even for someone like me, who's participated in campaign finance laws from from when we're going through legislative sessions to change the statutes to going to commission meetings, it's definitely more difficult for someone who's not familiar with this area at all. And so it's very important to understand that you need to have systems in place when it comes to collecting or expending any money in relation to electioneering activity. And the third thing I want you all to take away from this is that those who are interested in pursuing careers or participating in politics, you can do so in a nonpartisan way, because I believe that campaign finance, there's more diverse candidates that are out there, and there are more people who are wanting to know more about it. And you don't necessarily have to be partisan in order to participate in that area. And so just from my experience, I'm more of a policy person. I'm not really political, but I enjoy this area of law quite a bit. And so with that being said, I'll go on to the next slide. Just a little bit of my backstory. I have a law firm here in Georgia. I have experience in campaign finance, compliance, legislative consultation on the federal and state level. I worked in all three state government, every branch of our state government. Most recently, I was with the Court of Appeals as a staff attorney for one of the judges that were there. So I'm quite familiar with how all those things work. I've also worked for former governors and lieutenant governors. And now I mainly focus on helping political consultants and candidates get the best practices for complying with campaign finance laws in Georgia, as well as on the federal level. So enough about me. Let's talk about Georgia's campaign finance laws. I always tell people you start with the source, and the source that we've got to go to is the Georgia Government Transparency and Campaign Finance Act. Now, this was originally passed in 2010. It's been updated The most recent edition was in 2018. However, there have been some laws that have also been updated with each session, but some of the major overhauls happened back in 2018. The other thing that you want to look at is also the rules that are created by the commission. It used to be called the Ethics Commission. Most people still call it that, but they took the same name as the act, and it's really long. It's a tongue twister. So I'll probably just call it the commission or the Ethics Commission, but that's what I'm talking about if anyone has a question. The other things that you want to look at are advisory opinions, which are a great source for how the commission thinks, or as it relates to how they implement their rules or what they believe the statutory authority that they have. That's one of those areas where if you have a question, if you're a candidate, or if you're just someone interested in understanding how a rule applies to a specific situation, advisory opinions are a great resource for that. Also, looking at investigations of other campaigns are a great resource for understanding the source of the laws and their enforcement practices. Now, the commission is made up of about 5 people. You have a chairman, and then you usually have 2 representatives for both parties, and they're appointed in different ways by the governor. Lieutenant governor has an appointee. You've also got the majority leader and minority leader for the House and Senate. So there are different ways that they are, people are added to the commission, and they have a term and that sort of thing. But mainly the job of the commission, which is all under Title 21 of the Official Code of Georgia, their powers and duties are explained there as far as the administrative arm of implementing the act, which is the Campaign Finance Act. They also have rulemaking authority, so they can create rules and implement those things. They have rules that they can create and implement rules and that sort of thing. Oh, sorry.
If everybody could mute themselves, please. Mute.
I think I'm muted. Yeah.
So all right. So going back to the commission. So they've got the rulemaking authority. They also can do investigations, which is one of the key things that they do as far as being able to investigate any complaint either they come up with based on their review of different reports, or complaints that a third party, an individual citizen, can raise a complaint against a candidate or a committee based on their belief that they've somehow violated the Campaign Finance Act or any regulations related to the act. And so the commission can investigate it themselves, either because it's sua sponte, meaning they decided to do it, or someone brought the complaint to their attention, and they can issue civil penalties as it relates to that and consent agreements. Now, if it comes to criminal matters, they would have to refer that out to a law enforcement agency, generally the AG's office, the Attorney General's office. They handle those, but they also can refer those to the district attorney, depending on the person or the position in which that's the violation occurred. So if it's on a local level, more than likely they'll go to that particular candidate, that office holder's jurisdiction, and that's going to be where that complaint, the criminal matter, is going to be prosecuted. And as I mentioned before, they issue advisory committees, which can be very helpful in how to handle the statute. And lastly, and I think also most importantly, they're in charge of educating the public, particularly members of the public who are going to be regulated by the commission, meaning those who are going to have PACs, parties, individuals who are going to be supporting candidates. That's their constituency. Obviously, the general public is, but their main focus is to make sure people understand the rules and regulations as it relates to raising money in political fundraising. So let's talk about the money and some of these things that we need to go over as it relates to this stuff. One of the biggest things that anyone, no matter where you're running for, if you're running on the local level, statewide level, or just the municipal level, you've got to file what's called a Form DOI. This is a first step towards anyone who is going to raise money. If you're going to give money to a candidate, it's always good to check to make sure if they have filed their Form DOI, which will be on the commission's website. Now, this is important because if someone is collecting funds and they have not filed a Form DOI, this is a violation of the act out the gate. And that's a serious violation. You don't want to do it. It can cause a lot of things, both politically and criminally if you are collecting funds and you have not filed this form. Even if you're self-funding, because there are a lot of individuals on the local level who may not want to, go through the whole process of raising funds and having a committee, and that's fine. But even if you're going to self-fund your entire campaign, you still have to file a Form DOI, and it's a misconception for people who are out there and don't. Same thing with statewide and county municipal candidates. Now, the rules vary depending on what office you're running for. So when I say state or statewide, I'm talking about the General Assembly, governor, lieutenant governor, those individuals. Generally, the commission handles them directly. But if you're going to be on the county level or the municipal level, then you're going to probably deal with your county superintendent, your election superintendent, or there's a county clerk, a city clerk. They usually handle that on the municipal level. Depending on where you live, certain counties, they have partnered with the large municipalities within their jurisdiction, and they handle all of the election filing sort of information. But no matter where you're running, you need to make sure you know who do you have to send these forms to, because that's going to be very important. You don't want to send something to the commission and then they're going to reject it and then you're not filing things on time. So that's something that's definitely a key component to all campaign finance for the state of Georgia. The top takeaways that I would say for anyone who's going to file is you need to make sure you know who your campaign treasurer is and your chairman. The candidate can be their own chairman if they want to be. But if anyone's ever been involved in a campaign before and know how crazy things can get, you do want to have someone that you can trust that can be designated to be your campaign chairman and your treasurer. You have to put that information on that form DOI that I just showed you. One of the things that you also have to make sure is that if you are going to collect any funds, and let's say the person that you have as your treasurer can no longer serve, you cannot collect funds until that treasurer slot is filled by someone else. So you always have to have a treasurer, you always have to have a chairman, and it could be the candidate if you want it to be, but if you're a political action committee, you have to have a chairman, you have to have a treasurer. These people have to have records that are kept up to date, because at any point in between reporting periods, the commission can come to the campaign, the candidate, the PAC, whoever, and they can say, we want to see an accounting, a detailed accounting of all of the expenditures or contributions received. You have 5 business days to respond to this. And so that's why you have to constantly stay organized, be up to date. You can't wait till right before it's time to file a disclosure report before you then decide to get all of your ducks in a row, because if they come knocking before that point, you could find yourself in a lot of trouble. The third thing that you also have to be mindful of is the 3 years that you have to maintain your records. Now, I'm going to do an aside real quick, because there was recently, last week, we had a commission meeting. And during that meeting, a former state senator, some of you may know who he is, Chip Rogers. He was he was actually the majority leader for the Senate during his the last portion of his tenure. And just a quick backstory for Chip Rogers, from 2004 to 2006, he was in the State House. 2006 to 2012, he was in the State Senate. When he left office in 2012, he had $130,000 in his campaign account for his state Senate campaign. In 2012, or shortly thereafter, he amended his reports from 2009, 10, 11, and 12. When he amended his disclosure reports, he included, or he added, that he had loaned himself a certain amount of money, almost nearly $30,000. He said that he forgot to account for nearly $30,000 in loans that he'd made, personal loans he'd made to his account, because a candidate can loan however much they want to their campaign and have the campaign pay them back over time. But he didn't disclose that when he originally filed his reports. It wasn't until after he got out of office that he says, oh, I never disclosed that I gave myself a loan and now I'm going to pay myself back. Well, in that process in 2015, right before the statute of limitations deadline, 2 individuals, third parties, filed complaints with the commission saying that he had violated, Chip Rogers had violated campaign finance laws. It wasn't until 2016, I think June or July, that the commission amended that complaint and actually really started investigating. Now we are now in 2021, July. They are just now having a preliminary hearing on that. Now, the rules only say that you have to maintain records for 3 years. This has spanned nearly 20 years if you go back to when he first ran for office. This is why having records are so important, but one of the issues we're facing now with the commission moving so slow and when it comes to these campaign finance rules is that some of these records, we don't have them. So there's investigations that are going, I'm not entirely sure how it's gonna all turn out, but ultimately there's about $30,000 that it's unaccounted for, that the commission is saying that Mr. Rogers spent on personal expenditures. Mr. Rogers is saying they were all related to campaign stuff. And there's not a lot of detail as to what's accurate and what's not. And so one of the takeaways that I want you all to have, and anyone watching this, is that even though the commission, the rules only require you to keep 3 years of reports, you want to keep them longer, specifically if you have campaign funds after you are no longer serving in office, because that's how a lot of people get tripped up. And that's one of the main issues we're having now, is that between the statute of limitations, the commission moving very slow, and then also record keeping issues, these cases last forever. I know you've probably heard about John Oxendine's case, and there are plenty of others that have gone on for years and years. And part of that, I think it's sort of everyone's fault. It's the fault of the candidate for not maintaining records, but it's also the fault of the commission for not, acting on these complaints. If a complaint is filed in 2015, we shouldn't have a preliminary hearing in 2021. So that's my soapbox. I'll move on, but those are the takeaways I wanted to take from there. Now, when it comes to compliance for political fundraising, one thing I always tell everyone, make sure that you understand any money that's raised or spent as it relates to anything dealing with politics, as far as your campaign or a committee, it's the property of that campaign. And one of the things that I do for all of my clients, anybody that I advise, is that you need to incorporate your campaign so that you have it as a separate entity. Just like if you have an LLC, you start a business and you have an LLC, even though you put the money, it's a pass-through entity and you file a Schedule C on your taxes, it's still treated as a separate entity from your personal assets. And you need to protect yourself that way should there be a civil penalty or criminal issues that come along later. The other thing that you just keep in mind is that any monetary contributions that are received, you've got to make sure you deposit those into your depository account, meaning whatever bank account you have for your campaign. I have seen where candidates receive money and for whatever reason, they don't deposit it immediately because they maybe want to hold it and do like some grand big deposit for some strategic fundraising reason. The commission wants to know when you receive that money. The whole point of these campaign finance laws is to be able to account for any money that goes in and out of a campaign. And so holding on and hoarding those things for some grand strategic moment is no good. And it doesn't matter what kind of account you use, but if it's interest bearing, any interest, that you receive on that, or if it's some sort of some other account in which money is generated or interest is generated, you still can only use that interest money for campaign related purposes. So no matter what, just always keep in mind, whatever money is raised when it comes to campaign finance stuff and campaigns has to be for a bona fide campaign purpose. The other key takeaway when it comes to campaign finance is to know your limits. The OGC 21541, it tells you what the limits are and they authorize the commission to raise them. As of right now, the current limits for, as you can see on here, the current limits for statewide office, for primary and for a general is 7,000, and then for a runoff would be 4,100. And you can see that, as you can see, there are different limits depending on the election. Most people only think about one election, the general election, which usually happens in November. But there are actually 4 elections that happen in a cycle: the primary, the runoff, the general, and then the runoff. And so you can raise money and you have limits for each of those elections. Now, there's a form that you would have to file, which is called the Form CUSA. And I think it's like choosing option or something. I forget what the CUSA stands for, but essentially what that means is saying, I want to be able to collect funds for all of that. So let's say you're running for statewide, you can collect almost $21,000 or $22,000 total from one individual at one time, or they can give it to you at different times. You still have to account for when you spend money that's for the primary, you can only spend up to $7,000 of the full aggregated amount that they gave you towards the primary runoff, general runoff. You just need to make sure that you keep, and that's why, again, systems are important. Understanding how much money you receive is important. Who you receive that money from. Is it a partnership? Is it an individual? There's so many things that you have to consider when you are collecting funds as a campaign, as a candidate, even as a PAC. Also, as far as how you can spend those funds, they use the term, you can use it for ordinary or necessary expenses in connection with your campaign or being able to stay in office. It's very broad, but it's not that broad. And I'll give you an example. I had a client once who wanted to buy an entire campaign wardrobe, but not campaign shirts, because if it's a campaign shirt, that's completely fine. But if you're buying an entire wardrobe because you want to look really nice when you go on your stump speeches, the problem with that is that would you have, I always ask them, would you have bought this regardless of whether or not you were running for office? Because if it's just you buying something, you're like, oh, I would look really good for my speech. It's very hard for the commission to justify that being a necessary and ordinary expense. But if it says, if you're buying a bunch of t-shirts that has vote for candidate, candidate Jones, and you want to pass those out at a fundraiser or something like that, that's completely different, because it's clear that those expenditures are necessary or ordinary as part of what candidates do to stay in office or to get elected. And so people run into issues quite often when it comes to what they can and cannot spend, because the language in the statute is broad, but it's actually, when you start looking at it and implementing it in your campaign, it's quite narrow. I mean, you have to really make sure whatever you're spending that money on is that. So it can't just be you and your wife decided to go out to dinner and you wanted to use your campaign account because for whatever reason. But if you wanted to take a constituent and you were doing a constituent related thing and your wife was going to join you, then that could be considered a legitimate bona fide campaign expenditure. And so you just have to be able to justify whatever you spend that money on, got to be able to justify that if someone asks and follows up. And the reporting schedule is another thing that I want you to be mindful of, because even in a non-election year, you got to report. So we've got a report that's actually about to be due, which is June 30th. There's no report that's going to be December, but the June 30th report is important. And I'll tell you why the non-election year are just as important as the election year. The General Assembly meets every year from January, usually mid-January until about May-ish. Sometimes they'll get out a little bit earlier. They cannot, typically, under law, cannot accept funds during the session. But right before session, they usually have these huge fundraisers. And so that January 31st usually covers that fundraiser where all the lobbyists try to, lobby and get whatever they can as far as getting their legislation passed. They want to make sure that by January 31st, which is by that point session would have started, we have an accounting for who gave and how much they gave as of January 31st. The reason the June 30th is so important is because by that point, session is going to be over. And so after the bills have been passed, lobbyists are still working. And so you want to make sure, that June 30th is going to cover any amounts that lobbyists may have given to a candidate after the session was over, after laws have been passed. So those are why those two are so important. So even if there's not an election year, you're still required to file. And then you've got multiple election, during the election year, multiple dates. One date I want you to take a look at is October 25th. Something candidates constantly miss is they think it's October 31st. That's not, it's October 25th. And the reason is because most of the times elections are usually like the first Tuesday, that first Tuesday of November, or there's a second Tuesday, I forget, but it's early in November. And so they're not going to ask you to report on the 31st, because then you've got a little bit of a grace period before it's actually due, which could be after the election. And everyone wants to know by the 30th, October 30th, you need to have your reports done and filed. And so that's why October 25th and not October 31st is that during an election year. And you still have to do another disclosure at the end of the year as well, just if you received any monies after the election, because sometimes you do that. Special elections have their dates. Another key thing to keep in mind too is that 2 business day report rule. Any contribution you receive over $1,000 has to be reported within 2 business days, regardless of where you are in the reporting schedule, whether it's a non-election year or an election year. You got to file it. And the other thing too is the termination report. Within 10 days of, dissolving your campaign or your committee, you've got to file this report. And that means that you've zeroed out your campaign accounts, everything's been accounted for, and you're all good at that point. So what can you do if you have extra money left over after your campaign's over? Maybe you won and, it's November, 12th and you've won and you're in office, but you've got all this extra campaign money. What can you do? One of the things you can do is return it back to your contributors on a pro rata basis based on when that individual, gave and which election they gave towards. Most people don't do that. I'll be honest with you. They're going to hold on to that money as long as they possibly can. So another option is to transfer it to another candidate. So if you have to stay within the statutory limits, but a candidate can say, hey, I've got plenty of money left over in my war chest. I want to give to this candidate. They very well can do that. You can also transfer it to a political party. So if you're, Republican or Democrat and you want to, help out your local party or your state party, you very well can do that. And there's no limits there. And then you can give it to charitable organizations, nonprofits, PACs. People do that quite a bit. Some people form PACs in order for them to be able to send that money that way. Or you can just hold on to that money for the next election for that same office. Keep in mind though, if you are running, let's say if you, like Mr. Rogers, he was a state house representative first. When he decided to run for state senate, any money that was left over in that state house account could not be transferred to his state senate account. He starts at zero. The only thing he could do is potentially go to those contributors, ask them, issue a refund, and then ask them to send money for that next account. Probably didn't do that. He probably just used one of those other methods of disposing of those extra funds. But you cannot transfer between different offices, but you can for the same elective office. The other thing that's important when it comes to campaign finance is how to retire debt, which is again, what Mr. Rogers is having an issue with when he's saying that there was a debt, meaning the loans that he purportedly gave to his campaign. The rule of thumb and the best way to know if you have any debt left over in your campaign is if on election day, you still have things that you owe to, maybe you owe up for a billboard or a news ad or something like that, or campaign staff you need to pay. And the amount of money that you have on hand that day is less than what you owe, then you probably have campaign debt. And so you have to keep reporting that. It's very important that you continue to report that, but you can raise money specifically to retire that debt, which is, a novel thing. I don't know a lot of people who want to give to a candidate to help them retire campaign debt, but some do. And that's definitely their option. And so that's just another option there. But the point of it is that there are means for you to be able to pay off that campaign debt if you don't want to do it yourself out of your own personal funds. So one of the things I want to talk about really quickly is accepting and soliciting contributions during a legislative session. This past General Assembly session, we've SB 221. And before that, if you're a General Assembly member, you cannot seek or accept either a contribution or a pledge for a contribution during legislative session. Now, seek or accept, it's never really been defined, but so we don't really know exactly what seek or accept means because no one's actually defined that. But essentially, they can't take in money. They're not supposed to take in any sort of contributions, or no one's supposed to say, hey, I'm going to give you this amount during a legislative session. They could do it before the session. They could do it after the session, not during the session. And so they can raise, the members of the General Assembly, they can raise, and this also includes like statewide electors. Members of the General Assembly, they can also raise money for political parties and federal candidates. They can do all that during session, but they can't solicit any funds for themselves during session. So I know that a lot of times I've seen different events where, federal candidate, if it's a federal election year, and federal candidates come into town and members of the legislative of the legislature go and they're maybe on the host committee and all that, they can solicit for them. They just can't solicit for their own elections. And but something that's not really widely known is that both chambers, they have caucus leadership committees that already existed that could already raise funds during session. It's a weird thing in the law. It's a weird exception, but that was already going on. It's just not, it wasn't widely known, and it's not something that's really pushed. Then this year, SB 2221 came, and what it did was essentially say, it brought all of that really out in the open. It said, you can have these leadership committees, and essentially it's 4. You've got the governor, well, actually it's more than that. You've got the current governor or the lieutenant governor or the nominee of a major party for the lieutenant governor or governor. They can have a leadership committee. You can also have the majority and the minority caucuses for the House and the Senate. They too can have leadership committees. These committees are a new thing. The law itself is not very long. The actual bill that was passed and signed into law, it's not very long. But essentially what they said is these new leadership committees under these different labels, they can raise as much and spend as much as they want to. It's kind of crazy because it goes to, completely against the whole purpose of campaign finance laws and being able to track the money. Now, one of the talking points by those who are very, who are advocates for this bill, they said, well, you're going to be able to see who these individuals are who are contributing to the these different leadership funds and all that. But there's always a way around that, particularly if it's a PAC that's giving to these leadership funds, because they're not, they can give as much as they want. Some of these PACs don't have to disclose who their donors are. So it's just, there's still going to be dark money, which is everyone saying they don't want dark money. Dark money is always going to be there. It's just going to be a new way to get dark money into it. And when I say dark money, I mean money that it's hard to trace who it's actually coming from. And so SB 221 does not help with that, in my opinion. But I mean, it's just another way for these leadership committees to raise a lot of money without really having to abide by the majority of the campaign finance rules, regardless of what they said. Even though they may have to disclose things, they're not really abiding by the rules. And so it's going to be interesting. It actually does not go into effect until July 1st. So none of these committees exist as of today, but they will as of, I'm pretty sure they're going to exist as of July 1st or shortly thereafter, because this is a money grab, and the way that leadership can get more money, they're going to do it. And it's not just one side or the other. It's both sides of the aisle do this. Everyone does it. They want money. And I'm pretty sure that the 2022 midterm elections, we're going to see a lot of money in Georgia. We've already seen a lot in the past few elections. We're going to see a lot more. And these leadership committees are just a new animal in a sea of already just craziness, in my opinion. So we'll see how all of this turns out, but that's essentially what it is. They've created these new committees. They'll be able to solicit and gain contributions during a legislative session. There may be some issues there. One of the other concerns that some people have expressed, well, what about the bribery laws and that sort of thing? Lobbyists are aware of the laws that govern them. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to be very curious to see the lobbyist disclosure reports as opposed to candidate disclosure reports, because we'll know the lobbyists who are given to these leadership groups as well as individual candidates. So we'll be able to see all of that. We can see about double dipping. And I assume that there'll probably be some amendments to this new committee once the Wild Wild West situation sort of dies down. And one other thing too, another report that has to be filed, there's so many reports when it comes to campaign finance, are personal financial disclosure statements. A lot of candidates, when they first start out, they don't realize that they are required to file this. And depending on when they're running, usually it's within 7 days of qualifying for that office, particularly if it's a statewide candidacy. Key point to also remember is that the spouse's information. So it's not just the candidate who's running, but it's also the spouse's information and their direct ownership interest in any businesses or real estate, and their employment information, their status. All of that information also has to be disclosed. And so I tell people who are interested in running for office or being on certain boards, because if you are on a certain statewide board that you're appointed to, like the Ethics Commission, all of them have to file personal financial disclosure statements. They have to file them themselves. And so if you're going to be on any of these boards, I would suggest you make sure your financial house is in order, because people are going to look at your forms. These are public records. They'll be able to see. Now, it's not like your taxes where they'll be able to go super in depth, but they'll get a pretty good idea of what your assets are, what your debts are, all that kind of personal information that as a candidate, you're required to disclose. And so definitely something that you've got to consider if you're going to run for office or be a part of any of these boards or sort of any kind of elected official statewide or even on the county and municipal level. There's another bill that's not 221, but it's a very important bill because this is actually the bill that the State Ethics Commission was pushing during this past session. It passed through the House. It's currently in the Senate. I know they're going to probably amend it when they pick it back up in 2022. But HB 333, which is the Ethics in Government Act 2021, it'll be 2022 by the time this is over. This is a very important bill because there are some serious changes that they're going to make to campaign finance laws that I believe the reason why the Senate did not pass it is because they know that there are going to be some things that they're not going to like. And I know some specific senators who do not like certain provisions of this bill. One of the things they're going to do is they want to amend the procedures for enforcement because right now it's a little bit of a gray area. You have the commission, they can bring a complaint, but it doesn't have to be verified under oath. So they could just bring a complaint against someone. There have been complaints by elected officials saying that the commission is targeting them and all that kind of stuff. And so what that does is shore up the enforcement arm of the commission on how complaints and investigations can be initiated, because right now there is a lot of back and forth as to whether or not the commission actually has the authority to do some of the things that it's been doing. The second most important thing is the statute of limitations, which I alluded to before with the Chip Rogers situation. The statute of limitations, they're wanting to make it 5 years instead of 3 years. And they're also changing it depending on how long the term of office is and a few other things. That is a very important provision because when some of these instances where there have been, something that was missed on a report and later amended, that initial report, that is when the clock starts on the statute of limitations. But if you amend the report, 5 years later, well, the statute is actually run. There's nothing that the commission can do at that point. So even if they see it, there's nothing they can do because as of right now, it's only 3 years. So they're trying to give themselves more time to investigate and to also be able to find, to be able to go after individuals they believe have violated the act. The next thing is going to be the record retention and making sure it's longer than what it is now, because like I said, of the Chip Rogers, it's only 3 years at this point. That's not enough time if that's beyond the statute of limitations. Excess contributions as well, how those, like I was saying, how you can currently use the contributions that are left over after you've already won office or you've left office. Well, one of the things that has been a very popular choice by elected officials is to start a PAC themselves and to put all that money into a PAC that either they own or their family owns, and it's a nonprofit, but essentially they're on the payroll, so they end up paying themselves with those campaign finance contributions. And so excess contributions not being allowed in any way to allow public officials to be able to benefit from them. That's what that provision is going to do. And then finally, personal financial disclosure reports. They're trying to extend that beyond the prior year of the election to 5 years before you filed the election. So, 5 years before you decided to run for office, your financial disclosure has to cover all of that information from prior to that. That one, I'm not sure if that provision is going to last because there are some issues as it relates to that, but we'll see. But that's definitely HB 333 is something to watch in the coming session because that's really what's going to change campaign finance laws, not so much what SB 221 did this past session. And some common issues that I see, these are things that I see all the time with filers and things that people just constantly get in trouble for, and they don't mean to, but they do. The personal financial disclosures, not filing those things when you're supposed to. In a non-election year, because there's really no grace period. In a non-election year, you need to file it between January 1st and July 1st. You have no reason not to file it then. If it's an election year, if you've qualified within 15 days, and if you're statewide within 5 days. Disposing of the excess campaign funds. As I mentioned before, people just spend money on whatever they want. You can't do that. There are specific ways you can get rid of that excess campaign funds. You can't do anything outside of those. But I mean, like I said, they're trying to close the loophole on some of the popular ways that candidates have expended those excess funds. We've also got tracking your campaign debts and repayments, which is what Mr. Rogers is having an issue with right now, is that he had these new debts that did not exist when he first filed his reports prior to 2012, and he's been out of office since then, and he's still paying himself back on these alleged debts. The other thing I mentioned is the DOI and making sure that you file that before you receive any contributions. Anytime you've exceeded the amount of your contributions, that's also something people run into an issue, and understanding, the form CUSA and making sure they, say this amount of money that I received is for the general election or the primary election and whatnot. And just spending money on things that you have no business spending your money on. So, I mean, these are all sorts of things that I mentioned before, the October 25th versus October 30th during an election year. People get that one a lot. That is one thing that the commission looks for, because they know that people will file after the deadline, and you can't do that. So that's pretty much it that I have. I'm ready to answer any questions that you all have. Hello?
Anybody have any questions?
I would like to say that was an excellent presentation, and I can't wait to share it with some of my friends from outside of Carroll County who have been thinking of running for office. So I'm glad that we're recording this.
I want to reiterate that I'm so impressed. When I met you at the beginning, I wasn't sure if you were somebody I'd taught. That's what all the school teach. But as I say, where did you go to high school?
I went to high school at Tri-Cities High School in Fulton County. So I'm from Georgia.
Local, still a Georgia girl then.
I'm a Georgia girl. I went to UGA for law school. I'm a Georgia girl all the way.
Yay! Well, I am just so pleased and impressed with your delivery.
Thank you.
Well, what do you anticipate the new finance law, the SB 221, is going to cause a lot of extra fundraising?
I think it will, but we've already seen so much with the last few elections that we've had recently, the influx of Georgia, being center stage in elections now. So we've already seen that. I think what it's going to do is give current elected officials here in Georgia an opportunity to, get a bite of that apple. It's sort of a Wild West type situation as of right now, because we really don't know what it looks like. Because there's already the Republicans, I know they have a trust that the caucus has a trust, Democrats have a trust that they're already raising money for as a caucus for themselves. So this is just another committee that can collect more money. And so I think what it'll allow is some of these federal organizations, some of these outside, the state money to come in a little bit easier for these and have a direct impact on our local and state elections. I think that's really where this is going to be a little bit different than what currently is happening with some of these, the current caucus funds and the current trust that the majority and minority party have now. So I think that's really what it is. It's really going to allow outside of the state money to have an even more direct impact on our elections than what they already have now. But I mean, we'll see, because, obviously once July 1st hits, then once we start seeing these different organizations, we'll see what they're doing. And then obviously when the reports come out, I think the commission's going to have quite a bit going on. As of the meeting last week, this year, they're not going to raise campaign limits, but I know probably in 2022 that they will raise campaign limits a little bit higher. So that's going to be something that's going to be in play as well. They're maybe hiring another attorney there, and they're going to be doing some more as far as their staff. I think they got a 30% increase in their budget, which they need. They've also got a new filing system that everyone's going to be online with soon. It's not going to be, I don't think everyone has to do it as of June 30th, which is this year, but they will have to do it by the midterms, and when those reporting periods start at that point, they will have to do it, which will make it a little bit easier for us to track, because it's easier to see the reports that way. the current system is completely antiquated. So it's very difficult sometimes to figure out where everything is, but the new system I think will be a little bit better.
Any other questions? Well, Jen, we certainly appreciate your being with us tonight and agreeing to talk to us with this. These are all things that as observers, we need to know, or if any of us get a bug to get into this, we will need to know also. Anything else, anybody? Well, if not, I will say good night and thank you very much for being with us.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye now.